I was a child that went forth, and every object I looked upon was pity or love or dread. That object I became, and that object became a part of me. My memory is fragrant with the breath of cattle. I came from a race of drivers of oxen, milkers of cows. I first opened my eyes and hoped to close them upon a pastoral country.
John Burroughs was born on April 3, 1837, on a mountainside farm outside Roxbury, New York, at a time when most of the people in the United States were still farmers.
I was the son of a farmer, who was the son of a farmer, who was again the son of a farmer. My blood has the flavor of the soil in it. It's rural to the last drop.
I wish I could bring him back. Oh my. I enjoy talking about him because he's a man of whom I'm very proud. We called him Baba, you know, and he was very affectionate and happy to be with his grandchildren, and we always enjoyed being with him.
He was called the odd one, and his father couldn't understand why he wanted to read so much, and he would bring home books from the little school where he went, and he was less apt to condone his running off into the woods and things like that, but his mother was very sympathetic. She loved the outdoors. She loved to pick strawberries. He and his mother used to go and pick strawberries in the summer, and sometimes she would say, when they go to church, they went down to the Old School Baptist Meeting House. His parents were very religious, and sometimes Johnny would beg off, and his mother would say, well, let him go. It'll do him as much good. And she was always sympathetic with his writing, but neither of them ever read one of his books.
How little they knew of what is best worth knowing in the world. Father was a first-rate farmer. Mother never read a page of anything. Learning did not come easy to any of us, though Father used to tell his friends, John takes to learning. It's hard for me to remember arbitrary names and technical facts. Edison, how I envy him, can talk chemistry as if out of a textbook.
He was not a man who did anything about Christmas because he himself had grown up in a family that didn't really make any celebration of Christmas. He would come over and see us and look at our things, our toys and so on, and maybe have our dinner with us. But I don't have particularly the sort of memories that many children do of Christmas with their grandparents. That was different. His background had been rather, life had been rather austere up there in Roxbury, you know.
It was not until 1863, while teaching, that John Burroughs began to study and write about nature.
I had leisure, I was in good bird country, and I had Audubon to stimulate me. How eagerly I took up the study. It fitted so well with my country tastes and breeding.
The country was also changing, from agriculture to manufacturing. The time of the Civil War was also the time of great development. Men, materials, machinery, money, and Burroughs met his mentor, Walt Whitman.
So much at home with himself, so much a familiar spirit of the forest. He is the child of the woods, fields, hills, native to them in a rare sense, in a sense almost a miracle.
It was in Washington, D.C., when John Burroughs, at the age of 26, with wife back home and very little money, was looking for employment. He found a job as a clerk at the United States Treasury Department. The two men took long walks together along Pennsylvania Avenue, talking of soul and immortality, and even shared a bed.
There was no relationship of that sort. I know that is true. And I was much relieved to know that my grandfather was not involved in any kind of relationship such as that with Whitman. I know what you mean.
I've never loved a man as I loved him. I owe more to him than any other man.
When Whitman came up here, he was here 3 times visiting at Riverby. And one time he brought up a young man with him. And my grandfather was somewhat irked by the way they're kind of cutting up, you know. So it was there.
At the age of 36, Burroughs resigned from his post at the Treasury Department and went back to his native Catskills. He returned to agriculture and founded Riverby, a successful fruit farm on the banks of the Hudson at West Park in Ulster County.
Here's where I lived when my first essay came out in the Atlantic. I wanted to send them another right away, so I went to the parlor by myself. But Mrs. Burroughs thought it was a desecration to use the parlor for scribbling. When I insisted, she locked the door. Now that made me so angry, I kicked the door till I broke the lock. Then, of course, I was so upset I couldn't write.
And I guess the Civil War didn't register with him the way it did with Whitman and some people. He was not someone to plunge into things. He would go for walks with Walt Whitman in the woods, and they would meet soldiers, and he would talk about how sympathetic Walt was. And he said, it is pitiful, the soldiers, but he felt that rather than get involved and be a soldier himself, he was not that type of person. And he said, I think I can do more good by staying home and writing and doing my own work. This is what my calling is, writing. And so that was the reason he didn't enlist or get into the war. But there was a strange sort of well, I guess it's in all of us, a sort of dichotomy here, that part of you does one thing and you think of it afterwards. He didn't even go to Lincoln's second inaugural address, and he's blamed himself for that many, many times. He just, at the time, he was involved in his own life and in his writing, and he didn't think it was that important.
Reviewing Winter Sunshine in 1875, Henry James wrote that Burroughs was a more humorous, more available, and more sociable Thoreau, capable of remarkable felicity and vividness. Other popular nature collections followed, including Birds and Poets in 1877.
When I go to the woods or field or ascend to the hilltop, I do not seem to be gazing upon the beauty at all, but to be breathing it like the air. What I enjoy is commensurate with the earth and sky itself. It clings to the rocks and the trees. It rises from every angle and chasm. It perches on the dry oak stubs with the hawks and buzzards. I'm not a spectator of, but a participator in it. It's not an adornment. Its roots strike to the center of the earth.
There is a kind of artifice in his writing that Thoreau had very little of. He liked, for example, these exclamatory sentences that he so often used. You know, how I enjoyed climbing Old Clump to drive home the cattle, exclamation point, this sort of thing. His writings are full of exclamation points, yeah? And that's a conscious thing. It's not declarative sentences. You're not telling a story. You're doing it in a way that you realize is artful. Not that he wasn't a very lucid writer. I think he was. I have great admiration, especially for what he wrote about the Catskills.
By now, his nature essays were being read in American schools. After the Civil War, with the downfall of the landlords of the South, the victorious northern lords of industry pushed the country to the forefront of the leading industrial nations. This progress caused many changes in the way in which people were to live.
A farmer's fields become in time almost a part of himself. His life history is written all over them. He has fertilized them with the sweat of his brow. With his oxen, drew them into a line along the border of the woods, reclaimed them from the wilderness. Now the mowing machine runs evenly where once the cattle grazed with difficulty.
In 1896, McKinley is elected president with two promises: to protect American business and to free Cuba. America was now an empire. A vague hope long held by Burroughs began to take shape.
The walks through the woods, the glimpses, the vistas, how sweet it all is. Then I come back refreshed.
A neighbor suggested the name, Slabsides, a secluded cabin about a mile inland from Riverby.
Taking walks and things, he found this spot, and it was so secluded, really woodsy. And yes, it got him away from the house and things, so that he could write more freely and enjoy the outdoors more. Of course, down at Riverby, it was a farm, like a fruit farm. But up here, he was really right out in the woods. So he couldn't keep away from the farming. He raised lettuce and celery there for several years in the muck swamp there. Curtis, one of the brothers, lived with him at Slabsides quite a bit. And I know they were very good friends, but he said, of course, I have nothing in common with him except our memories. But they were good friends, and he came quite often. And his wife did not like to have company in the house or anything that caused much more housework. So he and Curtis lived up at the Slabsides a good many, for several summers. But mostly it was to get away from people, but the people found him. And pretty soon there were as many people going to Slabsides as there were to Riverby.
It was perhaps overemphasized, the kind of life he led at Slabsides. Slabsides was, to him, really a kind of backyard hangout. He did not, he may have done some writing there, but really the place for him to write creatively was the bark study over by Riverby. I rather think that those things were primarily pose. Slabsides was for him a fine place to entertain guests. It was a kind of guest house for Riverby. And yes, they made a great fuss over the simple man living the simple life over there in Slabsides, but it was largely myth, created by people outside him. He himself was very busy living his own life. He liked people. He liked to have people in to entertain them, but he found that entertainment of guests was simply not something that his wife enjoyed. And so he found a way of entertaining himself there at Slabsides. And it was a wonderful way of doing it. It was just really a good California cookout, New York style.
With contentment, the sage of Slabsides recalled these lines of Charles Cotton.
How calm and quiet a delight is it alone to read and meditate and write, by none offended and offending none, to walk, ride, sit, or sleep at one's own ease, and pleasing a man's self, none other to displease.
John Muir was one of the first famous visitors to stay at Slabsides. He was soon to be followed by Theodore Roosevelt, who earlier had written to Burroughs of his admiration, confessing that he had with difficulty refrained from urging Burroughs' writing not merely upon nature lovers, but upon lovers of manliness and right doing and of their country. Burroughs, now much in demand, was asked by the railway magnate E.H. Harriman to join him and his family on an expedition to Alaska.
Bow westward, faithful steamer, and show the east your heels. New conquests lie before you in the Aleutian fields.
From the bridge, Burroughs called to Muir on the deck below.
Muir, you ought to have been out here 15 minutes ago instead of singing hymns in the cabin.
"Aye," responded Muir, "and you, Johnny, ought to have been up here 3 years ago instead of slumbering down there on the Hudson."
John Muir was very much activist, very much involved in causes. Perhaps a good way of comparing the two is to think of Muir as being a Rocky Mountain outdoorsman and Burroughs a Catskill Mountain outdoorsman. There's a tremendous difference between the two.
At the age of 63, John Burroughs met the 45-year-old Dr. Clara Barris. She served as his secretary, companion, and biographer. She moves into the Burroughs household.
At this time, she was a doctor in the state hospital in Middletown. He was living it down on the Hudson. And I remember thinking of him as the man that came from his house on the big river, because he talked about the river a lot, and as the man who wrote books. And I also associated him with slab sites because we had visited him at slab sites. And I remember the smell of the house, how it smelled like the outdoors, and hearing the whippoorwill for the first time. And after that, always thinking that whippoorwills had something to do with Mr. Burroughs for a long while. And the cabins in the woods and like that, I didn't think they were anywhere else.
She was in love with herself. I know that. She was very ambitious for herself. She wrote in 1901 after she'd learned to type, and I have the correspondence, of course, and I have her journal, which I have turned over to Vassar College, which shows that she was ambitious. She wanted to be a writer, and through him she met other people. And so I cannot say it was impersonal love. It was a lot of it was a love for herself and her family. She rented this house here for my father, and she did take care of my grandmother in her last illness, and she took care of my grandfather too. But of course she benefited from it, all that, a good deal. It was to her gain.
Well, I think that the Burroughs family felt a little bit as if my aunt was usurping family duties, family care, but yet he needed this care and his family didn't actually give it to him, so that Aunt Clara supplied something that was necessary in his life, especially toward the end. I don't say they weren't there, but as for living with them, that just wouldn't have worked. And I think there was a little confusion after he died about who owned this and who owned that. I didn't let myself get into it because I just didn't want to remember that side of anything. I want to remember the good side. So I didn't listen much to the controversy. I had a cousin who kind of took care of those things, and I let him do it.
I cannot feel there was too much love, really. She hoped to be his second wife, and it was something of a blow to her when she learned that when grandmother died, he realized then, as he hadn't quite before, how much my grandmother meant to him, and there never could be another woman in his life. And so he did not make her the second Mrs. Burroughs. But always she gained from it. It was something, I cannot think of it as impersonal love.
There was a great deal of speculation, but I don't know that I'm the person to answer, except to say that as far as I'm concerned, there was nothing but a very deep friendship. From the time I was a child, I felt this. That was an unusual friendship. That she was giving him something that he had lacked all his life.
Why wouldn't you be the person to...
Well, I mean, the speculation and stuff, I don't know. I don't know how much there was to any of that stuff. She lived with him, yes. She lived with him for, after Mrs. Burroughs died, he came right over and had his home with her. And up at Woodchuck Lodge, we lived together like a family. There was a lot of gossip. I didn't realize it much when I was a child, but as I got older, I realized there was something talk there. But I never, you know, I lived right in the same house with him for several years, more than that, summers. And I never saw anything except a deep fondness for each other.
At the turn of the century, Burroughs was already a legendary figure, so draped with the American myth of the rural wilderness that the real essence of his work was being overlooked.
I pity you dwellers in town nowadays. Think what you miss in not hearing the evening song of the toad, the chorus of the peepers, the sunset challenge of the robin, the warble of the bluebird. I wonder if there's a so-called literary man who spends his time as I do, in the solitude of the country, amid the common people. Here I sit, night after night, year after year, alone in my little study. The world goes by me afar off, and I hear its roar and the hubbub, but care little to mingle in it. I love life. I want it as I do my spring water, clear, sweet, and from the original sources. Hence, I've always chafed in the cities. Life in the cities is like the water there, a long way from the original sources and more or less tainted by artificial conditions.
By the mid-90s, more people were coming to the Catskills to experience the world to which Burroughs had imparted a new kind of glamour. But most of them had never heard of Burroughs or read his books. They were immigrants struggling for economic betterment. The children and grandchildren of these people would read Burroughs and watch birds with all the enthusiasm of the affluent conservationists. But the time for that was in the future, our present.
One of the things that we've managed to do for quite some time is to separate our ties to the natural world because of what technology has given us. Now that we're facing the consequences of our technological inventions and industrialization to a much greater degree, we're forced to recognize that these things have not put us beyond the laws of the natural world. That again, as Burroughs said, hedge or qualify as we may, human beings are a part of nature. And this is something that we have been able to ignore, but now it's becoming more and more apparent that, as Burroughs said, that unless we recognize our relations to the forces amid where we live, our concrete bodily relations, we're like children playing with fire. Unlike so many nature writers who would present these scenes with grandiose adjectives, all sorts of affectations of style, Burroughs presented them in a style that was direct, crisp, and clear. And this is part of the reason for his great appeal at that time.
The urban tourists, uplifted with such evocation, came to the Catskills to commune with nature. On July 10, 1903, the President and Mrs. Roosevelt visited him at Slabsides.
The yacht came zigzagging up the river, looking for West Park Dock. The President appeared on the deck in a white linen suit and waved and called out, "How are you, John?" And we started off to Slabsides. He told me frankly, rubbing up against me as he spoke, that he found Muir and his books less charming than mine. I think I could see where the rub was. Both are great talkers, and two great talkers seldom get along well together. Now, he finds me an appreciative listener, and that suits him better. We paused here and there to listen to a bird. I pointed out the song of the orchard starling to him, which he didn't know. At Slabsides, they wiped their faces and looked about with satisfaction.
Yes, I do remember his telling about Mr. and Mrs. Roosevelt coming to Slabsides to visit him that day, and how the people from West Park came all down there to the pier when their boat landed, and how they walked up to Slabsides and had a dinner that Mr. Burroughs cooked, and how Teddy Roosevelt says, "Oh boy, this is the life. Give me this life anytime." He'd take it for what he had. He just loved that cabin in the woods, and he was a friend of Mr. Burroughs for many years. Mr. Burroughs visited him many times too. And but later on, at the time of the war, when Theodore Roosevelt wanted to push into the war, Mr. Burroughs felt that he was a little bit too warlike, maybe. I mean, too eager to get into things. He said he might better go slow. That's the only time I remember saying much about Mr. Roosevelt.
As you know, Theodore Roosevelt was a very good natural historian himself. And it was after Burroughs published that essay in the Atlantic Monthly called Real and Sham Natural History in 1903 that Theodore Roosevelt entered the controversy, and he's the one who actually coined the word nature faker. And it was as a result of this and his alliance with Burroughs against those who were falsifying the facts of natural history that Roosevelt invited Burroughs to go with him on a trip to Yellowstone National Park.
Now think of me riding down Pennsylvania Avenue in a carriage beside the President of the United States and treated by him as a friend and equal. Now, Roosevelt has a good deal of the boy in him. I suppose it's that makes him like me. Yesterday, when I dropped one of my gloves, quick as a flash, the President picked it up and handed it to me while I was talking to Governor Van Zandt of Minnesota. Now, I am elbowing with governors and senators. They no doubt think the President a man of queer tastes. You should have seen the crowds at St. Paul and Minneapolis. For miles, our carriages could hardly make their way. At one point, I saw a big banner borne by some girls, the John Burroughs Society. They pushed their way through the crowd and timidly handed me a big bouquet. I could only say, thank you. It touched me deeply.
My grandfather was pretty well aware that Teddy Roosevelt cultivated him as a friend because he knew he would gain something from it in the way of publicity. One of my most distinct recollections of later years with him was walking up the hill here at Riverby and his telling me that Teddy Roosevelt was still, shall I say, needling him to get him to write up his visit at Pine Knot with the Roosevelts. And he really, at times, wondered just how much personal feeling Teddy Roosevelt had for him. He was well aware that Roosevelt, in a sense, was using him for the publicity purposes. They got along together and they had happy times together, but there was that undercurrent. And my grandfather actually didn't write up the visit to Pine Knot with the Roosevelts until after Roosevelt was dead.
Foremost of all American writers on the outdoor life is John Burroughs. I can scarcely suppose that any man who cares for the existence outside the cities would willingly be without anything he's ever written.
The urban tourists had a conservationist champion, Theodore Roosevelt, and Burroughs became their guide. David Pierce commented that John Burroughs was as much a creature of the new age of industrialism as he was a denizen of the countryside. He mediated between the two realms of city and country. He mediated for the urban tourists, the benefactors of the industrial society. Alas, the sage of Slabside's wisdom could not aid his country cousins, who came in droves to the cities in search of work, many competing with the newly arrived immigrants.
Save 10 steps a day for each of 12,000 employees, and you save 50 miles of misspent energy.
Henry Ford thought of Burroughs as the greatest writer ever.
He had come along at the right moment. He ran his business in a rather old-fashioned way, no unions. He advertised that no Ford employee got less than $5 a day. But what he didn't say was that they would work 3 or 4 days and then he'd lay them off for 3 or 4 days. So that their annual income was no more. This was all over the United States. In every little town, people would say, well, I'll go to Detroit. Henry Ford pays a minimum of $5 a day. I heard it on the farm when I was a boy. He was a hero.
In the purchase of labor, as of any other commodity, you must be sure you are getting your money's worth.
Mr. Ford, of automobile fame, is a great admirer of my books and says there are few persons in the world who have given him the pleasure I have.
Emphasis on individualism, the background of these people was the farm background of small people struggling, and they were ingenious people at getting ahead. They were the cream, as it were, of the Americans of that time as far as getting ahead was concerned. They were the people who rose to the top. They were among them. There were others who were eccentric, too. A lot of great eccentricity among the rich Americans of the time, the Americans who were making it, not so much the ones who weren't, but the ones who really made it big. Many of them were very odd people. And it's understandable, a poor farm boy, to him this was success. He felt uncomfortable. Talks of how uncomfortable he was in a dress suit. He resisted all the outward trappings of the upper classes. And yet it meant a lot to him. And it meant a lot to him as a writer to help sell his books. He was quite calculating. And he was calculating in his association with Theodore Roosevelt and with these other people. And he was calculating in his association with the ordinary backwoods farmers. He was aware, he was very aware, and that's in his writing. Walt Whitman said about Burroughs once, "John never lets himself go."
When he went on these camping trips with Mr. Ford, Mr. Edison, and Mr. Firestone, he'd come back and he'd tell what a wonderful man Edison was. He says, but he's eating himself into his grave, he'd say. He says, how he likes to eat. And of course, Mr. Ford, he enjoyed, and he was surprised at how much Mr. Ford knew about birds and the outdoors, and how he loved those things so much. That's how they came together, was that they were all really nature lovers, but you don't think of them that way. But all I really remember very much about Mr. Edison, my sister and I had been baking cookies and things, because they were going to stay for tea. And I baked brown bread, and Eleanor baked the cookies. Well, when Mr. Edison got through, he said, when he said goodbye, he said, "Don't worry, Harriet, I won't forget that brown bread." Well, I was upset because I didn't make the brown bread. That's all I can remember about Mr. Edison that time.
His friendship with Ford started somewhere about 1913. Yes, there was this contradiction in his closeness to Ford, and even Mrs. Kelly's father, Julian Burroughs, became involved with selling Ford tractors at one point, something which he came to regret because he found that the land in Esopus was just not ready for Ford tractors yet. But yes, there could have been difficulties there in the friendship with Ford, but it never came up. And in many ways, John Burroughs, again, was a man of that time, and he was delighted to have the Ford car that was given to him, or the succession of Ford cars that were given to him by Henry Ford, but perhaps showing that he was still a man of the 19th century, he does not seem to have been a very good driver.
The sage of urban industrialism, Henry Ford, captivated by the flavor of the rural past in John Burroughs' work and in consultation with his advertising department, presented Burroughs with an automobile. It turned out to be a shrewd move.
It was the nature, especially birds. Mr. Ford was very interested in birds, and he read Mr. Burroughs' books. He says, "I've got to meet that man." And of course, the friendship developed as a personal liking for each other. He was very fond of Mr. Ford. He says he's like a boy. He's so interested in everything. And I think he was more fond of him than he was of Mr. Edison, I mean, in a personal way.
Edison, he's a great character. Whenever in our camping trip the car is stopped, he gets out and collects a handful of flowers and brings them to me, and I name them for him. Ford's interest in birds makes him forget everything else for the moment. He wants to give me more things.
Always wanted to give him money. Mr. Burroughs said, I don't want his money. But he says, here. And he gave us each a $100 bill. Of course, we'd never seen a thing like that before in our lives. But Mr. Burroughs says, I don't want his money, I want his friendship. And Mr. Ford was a very friendly person. We all liked him so much. We went out and stayed at his house overnight on our way west.
Burroughs was now the most widely read nature writer of his generation, the author of more than 25 books. What attracted these sages of industrialism to John Burroughs?
Ford, Firestone, and Edison wanted to see themselves as part of the American dream. In other words, what we keep coming back to is this pastoral ideal, which goes back to the very beginnings of this country. That is, where human beings tamed nature. Americans didn't live in the wilderness, but they made the wilderness into a pastoral home. And I think that those people who were in the forefront of technological change at that time saw themselves as just extending this image of the pastoral world.
9 o'clock, thereabout, into a bunks we climb, to dream away the dreary hour, we're cutting down the pine. 4 o'clock and thereabout, you hear the foreman shout, oh, all right, you teamsters, it's time that you got out. The teamsters, they got up, all in a frightened way. One cried, a lost sock, Smitten's gone astray. The other one said, I lost my hat, I don't know what to do. The other one said, I lost my cap and I am ruined too.
I think what Burroughs appealed to in some of these industrialists was their right-wing feeling that the days of old were the days of virtue. And when he fed them at slab sides and cooked onions in his fireplace and that sort of thing, this was what Grandma did. It was the real thing, and all the modern society was shut out. It was simply nostalgia for the old days, the frontier days, days of early settlement.
I went down to the river and I couldn't get across. I jumped on a sawbug, they said it was a horse. Now the horse wouldn't pull, so I swapped him for a bull, and the bull wouldn't bellow, so I sold him for $1. Now the dollar wouldn't pass, so I stuck it in the grass. And the grass wouldn't grow, so I swapped it for a hoe. Now the hoe wouldn't dig, so I traded for a pig. And the pig wouldn't squeal, so I swapped it for a wheel. The wheel wouldn't run, so I traded for a gun. And the gun wouldn't shoot, so I swapped it for a boot. Now the boot wouldn't fit, so I
remember so well our walks and talks with him. He was very eager to make me especially interested in wildflowers. And I remember especially one lovely spring day, we went up to the Ashokan Reservoir area where I saw for the first time coal's foot. And he told me a little bit about it. Of course, we have in this country a good many wildflowers that have been imported from abroad. He always made children happy, I think. I can't recall any time when the children were disappointed in what he had to offer.
One of the first things I remember about him was when I lived with my aunt, and he would come to discuss his writing because she did some editing and consulting with him, so he came quite often. I remember that when he came, we always took walks in the woods and fields, and that I can remember him as this gentle man who talked about the birds, and you could ask him anything and he knew what it was. And this day was very much like some of those days that I remembered.
Of course, he was, and this seems to me is important, he was brought up as an old school Baptist, And they're a very interesting group of people, you know. They didn't believe in Sunday schools, they didn't believe in church steeples, they didn't believe in instrumental music. They're wonderful people. I've known some of them. Wonderfully warm, friendly people who were very kind to one another. And, but they believed that before you were born, up in heaven, your whole life was written down and you couldn't escape from it. Predestination. And this was part of Burroughs' childhood. His father and mother believed very firmly in this. Everything was there about your whole life. You could do very little to escape from it. Your destiny, this was your manifest destiny of the individual.
He came home from somebody's house and they told him about this brigand steak. And before that, he had talked about eating woodchucks, remember? That we should try to eat woodchucks, and we even cooked some. I had to cook them. And the fat on the has to be all taken out. I used to say I smelled like Lady Macbeth after I fixed a woodchuck. And I was not crazy about them, but I cooked them for him. You had to parboil them and then fry them in bacon and onions to disguise the taste. And he liked to have them to offer to people when they came. Thought it was wonderful. Well, he went somewhere and they had one of these brigand steaks. And Aunt Claire and I breathed a sigh of relief. These brigand steaks can take the place of the cooked woodchucks. And they did.
That boy that you see here ultimately became the friend of the President of the United States, and many of the prominent people of the day. Became a very well-known author, known in this country and other countries abroad. And you would probably ask, how did it happen? How could he? He had so few opportunities. But he did it through his personality, his determination. He wanted to see more of the world. He wanted to make a name for himself. And he did succeed. But of course, in doing so, he wasn't spoiled. He still stayed his own charming self.
He was conservative in some ways in the way he looked back on the old rural life of his boyhood. He would like to preserve that. This he would have, if he could have made the effort, if he could have done something. Yes, he would have. But he had a sense of man's place on this planet that comes out in his later essays, not in the earlier ones, but in the later essays. He's very well aware of the relationship of all living and inanimate things in this world.
And when you begin thinking about the planet as a home, and it's our responsibility in many ways to maintain our home, then one of the things that Burroughs will do through his essays is to make us realize how much is going on around us of which we're totally unaware.
Well, the conservationist, of course, the word means to save, to preserve, whereas the environmentalist is interested in many aspects of the world we live in and is not necessarily interested in preserving the past or the present, but is interested in adapting it to human needs in order to ensure that it goes on. I think there is a distinct difference.
When I saw a chipmunk busily storing up his winter supplies, I thought how curious it is that these wild creatures, with no one to care for them, should get on so well. And I could not help thinking how many appliances, science, cooperation, and what laws and government we all require in order to live our lives. The condition in Europe at this time is different to ours. There, the energies of men have been directed not to accumulation of wealth, but to the destruction of wealth. Hence, while the war has enriched us, it has impoverished Europe.
More and more visitors invaded his solitude, and in May of 1910, his insatiable longing for his native hills caused him to return to them.
Those hills comfort me as no other place in the world does. It's home there. These hills fathered and mothered me. I am blood of their blood and bone of their bone. And why should I not go back to them in my last years?
It wasn't just the tourists, the people that came. It was a genuine love of the old farm, the hills that he had grown up seeing, and being able to come back. Of course, also up there, there is the Stratton Falls, and when we were there visiting him, we went with him to the falls and played in the water and so on. It meant for him coming back home, so to speak, and he loved it.
So he went back to the farm, and this woodchuck lodge is built on the other side, the west side of his farm where he was born. And from I think it was about 1908, he started fixing it up. And then 1910, they built the veranda. And he built all the rustic work on the veranda himself. And he was very proud of Woodchuck Lodge. And he went there every summer after that until he died. Mr. Edison wanted to put electricity in Woodchuck Lodge, but he wouldn't have that. He did have a telephone, but he put it way in the back room. He says, I don't want to hear it unless I have to. And well, some of those modern things, they bothered him somewhat, but he still looked forward to. I remember saying noise, that was one of the worst things of the modern world, where we went to, stopped overnight with some friends one time, and they happened to have some coal being delivered into the cellar. And that terrible racket going down the chute. He says, you see, we're not civilized yet. We wouldn't have noises like that.
The word guru was very useful for John Burroughs. He was really that in many ways for Ford and Emerson and Harvey Firestone and even for Theodore Roosevelt. There was something about him that made these people feel that he was in spiritual touch with higher powers through nature.
There is no such thing as being a totally successful guru. Gurus do what they can, and very often they end up in jail or discredited in one way or another. But in the meantime, they have given people a view of a different kind of reality, which has its value. And Burroughs was a guru in that sense of giving people a sense of the environment and of what it meant and our place in it.
The rapid increase of inventions and the harnessing of the powers of nature have set all nations to manufacturing more goods than they can use, and they all become competitors for world markets, and rivalries and jealousies spring up, and the seeds of war are planted. Material power. Drunk with this power, the world is running amok today. Will nature in the end be avenged for the secrets man has forced from her?
On March 6, 1917, Mrs. Burroughs died.
A long chapter in my life, nearly 60 years, ended. Notwithstanding the disharmonies, her death leaves a great void in my life. I have done what I most wanted to do in the world. So many persons are disappointed in life. They've tried shortcuts to fame and fortune. I refuse to run after false gods. My only justification is that I haven't wanted anything exceptional. I've been contented with the common things about me.
The old guru's romantic attitude towards nature gave way to the realization of the new age. Man's fate is bound up with the fate of the planet.
And when all the mineral wealth is used up, when all the coal and oil are gone, when all the fertility of the soil is washed to the sea, when the primitive rivers are no longer clean, when the wild game is extinct, and he said, what a sucked orange the earth will be then. And so we see this emphasis in his later life upon the whole planet as his home and the importance of recognizing our relationship to our home.
We were all a little bit worried about the trip home. And I remember when we got on the train, they had to carry him in on a, you know, I can't say it, a litter. And it just seemed to me, this is terrible, you know, as we watched him and all. But after he got on the train, he seemed to perk up a little bit. He was going home. And my aunt, of course, stayed right in the stateroom with him, and we three girls had a compartment out in the other part. And this night, my aunt came out and wanted to know if I would please come in and stay with her. So then I realized that he was probably not as well as he had been, but I didn't realize, of course, that he was as close to dying as he was, because there was one place he leaned down and said, "How far are we from home?" And I remember looking out the window and seeing the name of a town I didn't know, but on the end of it, it said Ohio. So I told him we were in some place in Ohio. And that's the last he said, his eyes closed. 3 days later, he was on the hillside farm.
Oh, well, no, I remember, of course. The funeral was here in my father's house. And I was weeping, of course. We hadn't really faced the fact that we were going to lose him. I remember several people at the funeral, and one was my father, who was stricken in grief. And I remember Thomas Edison sitting there alone. But much of it is lost in tears, I know. And of course, I remember also the burial up there at Memorial Field. And I remember with resentment the fact that there were news reporters there with news cameras taking pictures of the family in mourning. No, I do remember it, but it was a very sad time.
Almost everyone had on winter clothing because it had been cold, but that day turned very warm. My aunt had on a woodchuck skin coat that he had made for her, and she wouldn't take it off, but it was terribly hot.
I didn't know until afterwards that the news was all over the country. I have now a collection of the various tributes to my grandfather. The obituaries appeared in papers, Canada and the United States, and also abroad. And that is a collection that I keep, for they're now young people in the family, and I am handing on to them some of the things from the family that I feel they should know and keep.
I feel that I owe a lot of my life to him. And my love of the country and that. It's been so much of my life.
Nature is so indifferent to what we hold most precious. Why should she conserve souls? Her cycle of change, of life and death, go on forever. There's no future for her, only the everlasting present. And the grave's not dark or cold to the dead, only to the living.
Burroughs? Yes, I think he does. I think that he was someone who made people like Rachel Carson possible. His writing built up an enormous public in the United States for the environmentalists of our century, of the mid-20th century. They were there, these people who had read Burroughs in their childhood, and other people who went farther and with a deeper perception of what was going on politically and economically could build on that. I think he played a definite role. So, as I say, he was a popularizer. He was someone who brought something to the people.
Waiting by John Burroughs. Serene, I fold my hands and wait, nor care for wind, nor tide, nor see. I rave no more against time or fate, for lo, my own shall come to me. I stay my haste, I make delays, for what avails this eager pace? I stand amid the eternal ways, and what is mine shall know my face. Asleep, awake, by night or day, the friends I seek are seeking me. No wind can drive my bark astray, nor change the tide of destiny. What matter if I stand alone? I wait with joy the coming years. My heart shall reap where it hath sown, and garner up its fruit of tears. The waters know their own, and draw the brook that springs in yonder heights. So flows the good with equal law unto the soul of pure delights. The stars come nightly to the sky. The tidal wave comes to the sea. Nor time, nor space, nor deep, nor high can keep my own away from me.